Have you ever looked back on a relationship and wondered how you missed the warning signs? Maybe you replayed conversations, remembered uncomfortable moments, or realized that what seemed like small issues in the beginning eventually became impossible to ignore. That experience is incredibly common. Toxic relationships rarely begin with obvious red flags. If they did, very few people would stay. Instead, they often begin with charm, excitement, and hope. The warning signs emerge gradually, often after trust, emotional investment, and shared memories have already taken root. One of the biggest misconceptions about toxic relationships is that the damage starts immediately. More often, the most harmful patterns reveal themselves months or even years later. By then, you've built a life together, made sacrifices, and convinced yourself that things can improve. Understanding these late-appearing red flags isn't about blaming yourself. It's about recognizing patterns that emotional attachment can make difficult to see. Let's explore 7 toxic relationship red flags that often appear too late, and why recognizing them can help you protect your emotional well-being. One of the earliest toxic relationship patterns is also one of the hardest to recognize because it rarely begins with obvious disrespect. Instead, it starts with very small moments that seem almost insignificant on their own. In the beginning, your partner may appear thoughtful, attentive, and deeply interested in your life. They ask questions, they seem curious about your preferences, and they make you feel as though your comfort matters. This creates a sense of safety, making it difficult to imagine that the relationship could eventually become unhealthy. But as time goes on, those expressions of care slowly shift into expectations, and those expectations gradually become demands. The changes are so subtle that you often don't notice them happening in real time. It may begin with something as simple as questioning why you want to spend time alone. They might say they just miss you or that they love being around you. At first, this can even feel flattering. After all, who doesn't want to feel wanted? But over time, every request for personal space is met with disappointment, guilt, or suspicion. If you decide to spend an evening with friends, they become distant or upset. If you don't answer a message immediately, they ask where you've been or why you ignored them. None of these moments seem serious enough to raise alarm, but together they create an environment where your independence slowly begins to disappear. Healthy boundaries are not walls that keep people apart. They are guidelines that protect emotional well-being while allowing love to grow. Every healthy relationship includes respect for individual needs, personal space, privacy, and separate identities. You are allowed to have your own opinions, your own friendships, your own hobbies, and your own quiet moments without feeling guilty. A partner who truly respects you understands that closeness and independence can exist at the same time. In contrast, a toxic partner often interprets boundaries as rejection. They may act hurt when you say no, accuse you of not caring enough, or suggest that if you truly love them, you would always put their needs first. Over time, something important begins to happen inside you. Instead of making choices based on what feels healthy or comfortable, you start making decisions based on how they might react. You stop asking yourself what you want because you're focused on preventing conflict. You may cancel plans with people you care about simply to avoid an argument. You may stop expressing opinions that are different from theirs because disagreement has become emotionally exhausting. Little by little, your world becomes smaller, not because anyone forced you in a dramatic way, but because adapting seems easier than constantly defending your right to have boundaries. This gradual erosion of boundaries often leads people to question themselves rather than the relationship. You may wonder if you're being selfish for wanting time alone. You may convince yourself that every couple spends all their time together or that compromising means giving up more of yourself. But compromise is not the same as surrender. Healthy compromise involves both people adjusting while still respecting each other's individuality. Toxic compromise usually means one person keeps giving while the other keeps taking. One of the reasons this red flag appears so late is because boundary violations rarely happen all at once. If someone ignored every boundary from the very first date, most people would recognize the problem immediately. Instead, toxic patterns develop gradually, allowing emotional attachment to grow before control becomes obvious. By the time you recognize what is happening, you've already invested emotionally in the relationship and may even believe that things will improve if you just try a little harder. But lasting relationships are not built on one person abandoning themselves to keep another person comfortable. They are built on mutual respect, emotional safety, and the understanding that love does not require sacrificing your identity. The moment you realize that your boundaries are constantly being ignored is not the moment the problem began. It is simply the moment you finally see the pattern that has been quietly growing all along. Confidence is one of the most valuable parts of our emotional well-being, yet it is also one of the easiest things to lose in a toxic relationship because it rarely disappears overnight. Most people imagine that emotional damage comes from constant shouting, obvious insults, or dramatic moments of conflict. While those experiences certainly leave scars, confidence is often eroded much more quietly. It fades through repeated comments, subtle criticism, dismissive reactions, and countless moments that seem too small to confront individually. Each incident feels insignificant on its own, but together they slowly reshape how you see yourself. At the beginning of the relationship, your partner may compliment you constantly. They admire your intelligence, your personality, your appearance, and your ambitions. Their admiration makes you feel seen and appreciated. But as the relationship progresses, those compliments become less frequent and are gradually replaced by criticisms disguised as honesty or concern. They might joke about your appearance and tell you that you're too sensitive if you don't laugh. They may point out your mistakes while ignoring your accomplishments. They may question your decisions so often that you begin doubting your own judgment. Every comment seems small enough to dismiss, yet each one leaves a tiny crack in your confidence. One of the most confusing aspects of this pattern is that toxic criticism is rarely direct all the time. It often comes mixed with affection, making it difficult to recognize. One day they praise you, and the next day they tell you that no one else would tolerate your flaws. They may say they're only trying to help you become a better person, or that they're giving you advice because they care. This inconsistency keeps you emotionally off balance. Instead of recognizing the criticism as unhealthy, you work even harder to earn back the approval that once came so easily. Slowly, your inner dialogue begins to change. You stop trusting your instincts because they've questioned them so many times. Before making even simple decisions, you wonder what they will think. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for mistakes you might have made. You apologize more frequently, even when you've done nothing wrong. You become hesitant to express your opinions because you're afraid they will be dismissed, criticized, or turned into another argument. What was once confidence becomes self-doubt, and what was once independence becomes constant reassurance seeking. This is one of the reasons emotional manipulation can be so damaging. It doesn't just change how you view the relationship, it changes how you view yourself. You may begin believing that you're too emotional, too difficult, too forgetful, or simply not good enough. The painful reality is that these beliefs often didn't exist before the relationship. They developed because someone repeatedly reflected a distorted version of you until you started accepting it as the truth. Healthy relationships have the opposite effect. A supportive partner doesn't make you feel perfect, but they make you feel capable. They encourage your strengths while respecting your imperfections. They celebrate your achievements instead of competing with them. They offer constructive feedback without attacking your character. Most importantly, They create an environment where you feel safe enough to grow rather than constantly fearing failure. Being loved should increase your sense of security, not diminish it. Another warning sign appears when you notice yourself becoming dependent on your partner's approval. Their opinion begins to carry more weight than your own. A compliment from them can lift your entire mood, while a small criticism can ruin your day. This emotional dependence gives them enormous influence over your self-esteem, whether they realize it or not. Over time, you stop measuring your worth by your own values and instead rely on their constantly changing opinions to determine how you feel about yourself. Many people only recognize this red flag after the relationship has ended. They look back and realize they were once more confident, more outgoing, more decisive, and more comfortable expressing themselves. They remember a version of themselves that laughed more easily, trusted their own judgment, and didn't constantly second-guess every decision. That realization can be heartbreaking, but it can also become the beginning of healing. Confidence that has been damaged can be rebuilt. The first step is recognizing that your value was never determined by someone else's criticism. A healthy relationship should never require you to shrink, silence yourself, or question your worth in order to be loved. The right relationship doesn't slowly take away your confidence. It helps you rediscover the strength that was always there. Disagreements are a normal part of every close relationship. Two people with different personalities, experiences, and expectations are naturally going to see certain situations differently. Healthy couples are not successful because they never argue. They are successful because they know how to repair after conflict. They listen, they take responsibility for their actions, they apologize sincerely, and they make meaningful changes that prevent the same problems from happening repeatedly. In a toxic relationship, however, conflict slowly stops serving this purpose. Instead of leading to understanding and growth, every disagreement becomes another exhausting cycle that leaves both the issue and your emotional needs unresolved. At first, you may believe that every couple goes through difficult periods. You tell yourself that stress from work, family responsibilities, or personal struggles is making communication harder than usual. You remain hopeful because every argument ends with promises that things will improve. Your partner may tell you they understand your concerns, promise to change, or assure you that this was just an isolated incident. Those promises give you hope, and hope encourages you to stay patient. But after weeks or months pass, you realize the same argument keeps returning almost word for word, with nothing actually changing. One of the clearest signs that conflict has become toxic is when every disagreement shifts away from the original issue. Instead of discussing what hurt you, the conversation becomes focused on your tone, your timing, or your reaction. You try to explain why something upset you, but suddenly you're defending yourself against accusations that you're too emotional, too sensitive, or impossible to please. The original concern disappears completely, replaced by a debate about your personality. This can leave you feeling frustrated because the problem you wanted to solve is never actually addressed. Over time, these conversations become increasingly confusing. You may begin questioning your own memory because your partner insists events happen differently than you remember. They deny things they clearly said, minimize promises they made, or rewrite past conversations in ways that leave you wondering if you're imagining everything. This constant confusion slowly weakens your confidence in your own perception. Instead of trusting your experiences, you begin relying on their version of reality. When someone consistently causes you to doubt your own understanding of events, meaningful conflict resolution becomes nearly impossible because both people are no longer discussing the same reality. As these patterns continue, something changes inside you. You stop bringing up important concerns because you've learned what the outcome will be. Every conversation feels emotionally draining, and you already know how it will end. Instead of feeling heard, you'll feel blamed. Instead of finding solutions, you'll leave feeling guilty for speaking up in the first place. Silence starts to feel safer than honesty. You convince yourself that keeping the peace is easier than facing another exhausting argument. Unfortunately, avoiding conflict doesn't solve relationship problems. It simply allows resentment, disappointment, and loneliness to grow beneath the surface. Healthy communication requires accountability, and accountability means accepting responsibility without immediately becoming defensive. In toxic relationships, accountability is often replaced by excuses, denial, blame, or distraction. If you point out hurtful behavior, your partner may immediately remind you of your own mistakes. If you ask for change, they may focus on everything you've done wrong instead. Every attempt to solve one problem somehow becomes an opportunity to criticize you. Eventually, you spend more time defending yourself than discussing the issue that brought you into the conversation. Another painful consequence of unresolved conflict is emotional exhaustion. You begin rehearsing conversations in your mind before having them because you're trying to predict every possible reaction. You carefully choose your words, hoping that this time your message won't be misunderstood. Yet no matter how gentle or thoughtful you are, the outcome remains the same. The conversation circles back to familiar arguments, familiar accusations, and familiar disappointments. This emotional labor becomes incredibly draining because you're investing enormous energy into discussions that produce little or no lasting change. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this red flag is that hope often keeps people trapped in the cycle. Every apology feels like a fresh start, every promise sounds sincere, and every brief period of peace convinces you that real change is finally happening. But healthy relationships are measured by consistent actions, not repeated promises. Words can provide temporary comfort, but only changed behavior creates lasting trust. When months or even years pass and the same painful conflicts continue without genuine improvement, it becomes clear that the relationship is repeating patterns instead of growing. Real love is not demonstrated by how passionately someone apologizes after hurting you. It is demonstrated by how committed they are to making sure the same hurt does not happen again. One of the most painful changes that can happen in a toxic relationship is the gradual disappearance of empathy. In the beginning, your partner may seem incredibly caring and emotionally available. They listen attentively when you talk about your fears, comfort you when you're upset, and make you feel like your emotions truly matter. They ask how your day was, remember the little details you share, and respond with kindness when you're struggling. These moments create emotional safety and deepen your trust. You begin to believe that this is someone who genuinely understands you. That sense of connection becomes one of the strongest reasons you stay invested in the relationship. Unfortunately, in many toxic relationships, this level of empathy slowly fades over time, and because the change is gradual, it can be difficult to recognize until the emotional distance has become impossible to ignore. The first signs are often subtle. You tell them about a stressful day, and instead of listening, they immediately shift the conversation back to themselves. You share something that hurt your feelings, and they respond with irritation rather than concern. When you're overwhelmed, they accuse you of overreacting instead of asking what you need. At first, you assume they're tired, distracted, or dealing with their own problems. Everyone has difficult days, and healthy relationships allow room for that reality. But when this pattern becomes consistent, you begin to realize that your emotions are no longer being treated with the same care they once received. Over time, emotional invalidation becomes more common. You express sadness, and you're told you're being too sensitive. You explain why something hurt you, and they insist you're making a big deal out of nothing. Instead of trying to understand your experience, they dismiss it, minimize it, or criticize you for having emotions in the first place. This creates a confusing emotional environment because you stop feeling safe enough to express yourself honestly. Before sharing your feelings, you start asking yourself whether they'll think you're being dramatic or difficult. Eventually, you begin keeping your struggles to yourself because silence feels easier than being dismissed. One of the most damaging effects of losing empathy in a relationship is that it changes how you view your own emotional needs. Instead of believing your feelings deserve attention, you start convincing yourself that you're expecting too much. You lower your standards little by little. You stop asking for comfort because you assume it won't be given. You stop expecting understanding because disappointment has become familiar. This emotional withdrawal isn't a sign that your needs have disappeared. It's a sign that you've learned not to expect them to be met. Healthy empathy is not about agreeing with every emotion someone has. It's about being willing to understand their perspective, even when you see things differently. A caring partner may not always have the perfect words, but they make an effort to listen without immediately becoming defensive. They recognize that your emotional experience is real, even if they would have reacted differently in the same situation. They don't make you feel ashamed for being hurt. Instead, they work with you to understand why the situation affected you and how both of you can move forward together. In a toxic relationship, however, empathy is often replaced by self-protection. Every conversation about your feelings becomes centered on how uncomfortable it makes them feel. If you express disappointment, they focus on how unfair your criticism is. If you cry, they become annoyed rather than concerned. If you explain that something they did caused pain, they respond by defending themselves instead of acknowledging your experience. The conversation stops being about healing and starts becoming about avoiding responsibility. As a result, your emotional world becomes increasingly lonely, even though you're in a relationship. This lack of empathy often extends beyond major life events into everyday interactions. When you're sick, they seem inconvenienced rather than supportive. When you achieve something important, they struggle to celebrate your success because the attention is no longer on them. When you're grieving, anxious, or emotionally exhausted, they offer criticism instead of comfort. These repeated experiences slowly teach you that your emotional well-being is not a priority within the relationship. That realization can be incredibly painful because one of the deepest human needs is to feel understood by the people we love. Perhaps the saddest part of this red flag is that many people spend years trying to earn back the empathy they experienced at the beginning of the relationship. They believe that if they become more patient, more understanding, or less demanding, their partner will return to being the caring person they once knew. They continue giving compassion while receiving very little in return, hoping that one day things will go back to how they were. But healthy relationships do not require you to constantly prove that your emotions deserve respect. Genuine love creates emotional safety, where both people feel heard, valued, and supported. When empathy disappears, emotional intimacy begins to disappear with it, leaving behind a relationship that may continue on the surface, but no longer provides the understanding, comfort, and connection that love is meant to offer. Healthy relationships are built on balance. They are not about keeping score or making sure every single action is perfectly equal, but they do require mutual effort, mutual respect, and mutual responsibility. Both people contribute to the relationship in meaningful ways. Both people make sacrifices when necessary. Both people apologize when they are wrong. Both people celebrate each other's successes and support one another during difficult times. This sense of reciprocity creates trust because each partner knows they are not carrying the relationship alone. In a toxic relationship, however, this balance slowly begins to disappear. What once felt like teamwork gradually turns into a situation where one person is giving almost everything while the other continues taking without recognizing or appreciating those efforts. At first, the imbalance is easy to justify. Your partner may be going through a stressful period at work, struggling with family issues, or facing personal challenges. You naturally want to support someone you love, so you willingly give more of your time, energy, and emotional support. Healthy relationships often involve moments when one person carries a little more weight because life is unpredictable. The problem begins when this temporary imbalance becomes permanent. Weeks turn into months, and months become years. You continue making sacrifices while your partner grows increasingly comfortable receiving without giving the same level of care in return. You may notice that you are always the one reaching out after an argument. Even when they have hurt you, you find yourself sending the first message, suggesting a conversation, or apologizing just to restore peace. You tell yourself that someone has to be the bigger person, but eventually you realize that you are always the bigger person. They expect forgiveness without earning it. They expect understanding without offering it. The responsibility for repairing the relationship quietly becomes your job, while they simply wait for the conflict to pass. This imbalance often extends into emotional support as well. Whenever your partner has a difficult day, you listen patiently, encourage them, and make space for their emotions. You remember important events in their life, check on them when they are struggling, and try to make them feel understood. But when you need the same support, the response is completely different. They seem distracted, impatient, or emotionally unavailable. Conversations about your feelings are cut short, while discussions about their struggles can last for hours. Over time, you begin to feel more like a therapist, caregiver, or emotional caretaker than an equal partner in the relationship. One of the most dangerous aspects of a one-sided relationship is how slowly it changes your beliefs about love. You begin convincing yourself that loving someone means constantly sacrificing your own needs. You believe that if you just become more patient, more understanding, or more forgiving, the relationship will finally become balanced again. Instead of asking whether your needs are being met, you become focused entirely on meeting theirs. Your happiness becomes dependent on keeping them comfortable, even if it means ignoring your own emotional well-being. As this pattern continues, emotional exhaustion begins to take its toll. You find yourself constantly thinking about how to avoid upsetting them, how to make them feel appreciated, or how to solve problems they should also be helping to solve. Every disagreement becomes your responsibility to fix. Every disappointment becomes your responsibility to understand. Every emotional burden somehow ends up on your shoulders. You may not even realize how much energy you are spending because the role of caretaker has become so familiar that it feels normal. But love should never require one person to carry the entire emotional weight of the relationship, while the other simply benefits from that effort. Another painful sign of a one-sided relationship is that your accomplishments and dreams slowly become less important. When something exciting happens in your life, instead of celebrating with you, your partner may dismiss your success, change the subject, or somehow make the conversation about themselves. You begin minimizing your achievements because they rarely receive genuine encouragement. At the same time, you continue celebrating every one of their accomplishments because supporting them has become second nature. This imbalance reinforces the idea that their happiness matters more than yours. Even though a healthy relationship creates room for both people to thrive, many people remain in one-sided relationships because they mistake endurance for love. They believe that the more they sacrifice, the stronger the relationship will become. In reality, love grows through mutual investment, not one-sided devotion. A relationship cannot remain emotionally healthy if only one person is consistently making the effort to communicate, forgive, support, encourage, compromise, and grow. Genuine love is not measured by how much you are willing to lose yourself for another person. It is measured by whether both people are equally committed to protecting each other's emotional well-being. If you constantly feel like you are carrying the relationship alone while your own needs remain unnoticed, it may not be a sign that you need to try harder. It may be a sign that the relationship has stopped functioning as a partnership and has become an emotional burden that only one person is expected to carry. Perhaps the most heartbreaking red flag in a toxic relationship is not a specific argument, betrayal, or dramatic event. It is the quiet realization that somewhere along the way, you stopped feeling like yourself. This realization usually doesn't happen overnight. It arrives slowly, often during an ordinary moment. You look at old photographs and notice a smile that seems unfamiliar. You reconnect with an old friend who comments that you don't seem like the same person anymore. You remember hobbies you once loved, dreams you once chased, and the confidence you once carried so naturally. Suddenly, you begin asking a painful question: when did I change? The answer is often difficult to find because toxic relationships rarely transform a person through one major event. Instead, they reshape someone through hundreds of small experiences that slowly alter the way they think, feel, and live. At the beginning of the relationship, you probably felt free to express your personality. You laughed without worrying about how it would be received. You shared your opinions openly, pursued your interests, and spent time with friends and